Since we're already at a full house, I think we're going to split the difference between real time and Berkeley time. So every now and then, you get to take advantage of the misfortunes of others. So I have the great fortune to get to introduce our speaker today, Professor Shafi Goldwasser, which is such a wonderful opportunity. So I am not Jim Demmel, the chair of electrical engineering and computer sciences. Poor Jim got stuck down in our local medical establishment. I feel this is only fitting that I get this opportunity to take advantage of his misfortune, because when I was chair, every year at grad student visit day, I would close my talk with a quote from Shafi Goldwasser that said, "The only problem about Berkeley is you never really can be happy anywhere else in the world." We've thanked her for that for many years, and we are so happy that she can be happy once again. Now, I did keep accumulating things that I'm supposed to say, which is why we're starting a little early. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm David Culler. For those of you, it is not quite so many. We are being live streamed, so if you can't find a place in here, you actually do get to sit down out there and elsewhere. So feel free to find more comfortable housing outside. I was also told to inform you before I begin that we have not one but two distinguished talks today. So if you want to catch the other, you have to run across the street, of course, at the green light, to catch the benefits of mixed signal computing and artificial intelligence over in the HP Auditorium at 4 with Dave Fick. So if Jim were here, he would have explained that today is the first in a series of talks in celebration of the 50th anniversary of computer science at UC Berkeley. That's a little bit of a trivia test to understand what that means. And a celebration of 8 ACM Turing Award winners. And this is the interesting part, who received their award for work that they did at Berkeley. Many compete for how many Turing Award winners they have. But we're focusing this on where the actual work got done. So this is a lovely opportunity, as well. This is co-sponsored by the Department of ECS and the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing. So for the next 8 weeks, Jim will host these outstanding researchers in this special series called the Turing Talks. They're technical lectures, but one's intended for a broad audience. And the other thing that I so love about Shafi's talks is also it's an observation of why you need to be committed and ready to persevere with your inventions, because they're not always received immediately. I want to also observe that, beginning next week on Wednesday at noon, in partnership with the CS Theory Group, we'll be hosting a set of lunches in the Wozniak Lounge, and the first of those will be this week's speaker. So in addition to the talks, you get to follow up with the lunch. And let's see. So our inaugural talk will be given by Shafi Goldwasser. Professor Goldwasser received her PhD from UC Berkeley in 1984, advised by Manuel Blum, another speaker in our series. And her research includes computational complexity theory, cryptography, and computational number theory. She's the co-inventor of probabilistic encryption, which set up and achieved the gold standard for security for data encryption. She's also the co-inventor of zero-knowledge proofs, a key tool in the design of cryptographic protocols. Shafi received the Turing Award in 2012 with Silvio Macaulay for their joint work in cryptography, and she's also not once but 2-time winner of the Gödel Prize. Currently director of the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing and professor in computer science. She holds appointments at MIT and the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel, and is chief scientist and co-founder of Duality Technologies, a data analytics startup. And we are so lucky to have her today. Please welcome Shafi Goldwasser.
So hi everyone, so I'm Shafi, and I'm going to talk about from basic idea to impact, the story of modern cryptography. I think that it's an exaggeration to say that this is a technical talk, as you shall see, but it's an interesting talk, but not so technical. So the story of modern cryptography, just personally speaking, this is Evans, where we had, where I was a graduate student, together with Mike Luby here, and Faith, yeah, maybe a few others, and Jim Demel if you were here, that was the early 80s, and then I went to MIT and Weizmann for 35 years, and now I'm back. And I guess, I don't know about the happiness part, but, but the idea of coming back from, really the big allure, besides the fact that I think the Simons Institute is great and the department is great, is really that this time in the 80s when I was here, it was really a remarkable period in terms of creativity and growth, both personally and scientifically. And this idea that you can come back to such a time is fantastic in my eyes. So really, what was, if you wanted to deconstruct sort of these Berkeley days, at least when we were graduate students in the early 80s, I think I would say that there were sort of three things. There were very wise mentors, and there's Manuel Blum was my advisor, and Descartes was sort of a secondary advisor, and Jean Lawler, and they were the theory group, the theory faculty, and all the theory students were going with them to lunches, and they were asking us all these questions, which maybe to them there were obvious questions to ask about generality of our results and what does it mean, but to us this was like the whole world, that question is what defined our work often. And then there were ambitious peers. I think that's very important. And in fact, all my peers, have gone on to do great things, and they wanted to do great things right off the start. And of course, this was a very young field at that time, and it was very receptive to new ideas, to sort of big ideas, to modeling, to definitions, to directions. And that meant that you could sort of do, I think, things of that sort much more easily maybe than today. But with all that, really the place where I have, I think sort of certainly my PhD work and work for many years was a course that Manuel Blum taught. And this is sort of a page, this is his handwriting from the first lecture, and apparently he says here, you may have 5 minutes of my time whenever you need it, only 5. I actually think he gave more, but not necessarily always. But in any case, it was an amazing class. It was about number theory, or what we call algorithmic number theory. So there were all these things that, mathematicians, that's bread and butter for them, all these elementary computations, less elementary computations. Usually in mathematics, you don't necessarily think of it as a computation. Manuel taught it sort of as an algorithmic questions. How do you compute where the numbers are prime? How do you solve equations? How do you compute Jacobi symbols? Things of that sort. So it was always a fast algorithm to do something very classical, very simply defined in number theory. But the important part was that in the last lecture, he actually talked about 4 papers. At that point, that was all of sort of modern cryptography. This paper, which I'll talk about in a minute, by Diffie-Hellman, by RSA, Reverse Shamir and Adelman, by Rabin, some breaking paper. So there were 4 papers that he presented, which they all used number theory. So that's why they were relevant to this class. But they were sort of applying number theory to some questions that had to do with secret communication, signing contracts over the telephone. And at the end of the class, he asked this question, which I thought was fantastic. I don't know exactly why, but maybe that's how you actually grab onto a topic. He asked, how can 2 parties flip a coin over the telephone? So they don't have a coin in front of them, they don't trust each other, because if it's heads, you win, and if tails, the other person wins. How can you do that using number theory so there is no advantage more than 50-50, heads or tails, one versus the other? And somehow there was something about that question, but the idea that you could use number theory, not clear how, but use number theory to emulate this real life problem, which I found fascinating and sort of started me off on research. So as you can see, that seems like a silly problem. Why would Alice and Bob want to flip coin over the telephone? I think that's my point, that it was a silly but beautiful problem. And in fact, I've been in this field for a long time, as my graduation year indicates, and it is really surprising to see the consequences of a lot of very basic cryptographic questions that might seem silly when you ask them, like tossing a coin over the telephone. So, for example, electronic commerce, today we talk about cryptocurrency, even factoring on a quantum computer, cloud computing. This is all sort of applied areas, places where we actually use cryptography in the real world, but even for sort of serious complexity theory. How NP got a new definition, probabilistically checkable proofs, the question of pseudo-randomness. I think this is the cover of Mike Luby's book. I take these things off the internet, don't tell anyone. Anyway, all these very fundamental things, either impacting our world or impacting our science, have started out from very basic questions which are sort of curiosity driven. And I know for a fact, because I know these papers. So, and I think that the next sort of frontier, maybe this time it is more derived by applications, is the question of whether how cryptography can help for doing what I call safe machine learning, and I will get to that at the latter part of my talk. Okay, so the way that the talk is structured is essentially 3 parts. First of all, I kind of want to show you sort of a few highlights of how these really basic questions or basic ideas came about. Okay, then I'll talk about what the safe machine learning, what are the challenges and the opportunities for cryptography to contribute to what I call safe machine learning. And even if we are lucky, we'll get to some sampling of what is already done today on this problem of safe machine learning. Okay, so let's start really sort of in the beginning, and that is that at the beginning, there's a lot of stories I could tell about sort of ideas from cryptography that have changed really our world, or at least our digital world. There's public key cryptography, there's zero-knowledge proofs, there's something we call multi-party computation, and homomorphic encryption, which is a way to compute in the dark, compute on secret data without actually looking at it. There's post-quantum cryptography, there's blockchains, or what some people know as bitcoins or cryptocurrencies. So there's a lot of stories. Obviously, I won't be able to tell all of them, but I'm going to choose a few of them, and then we'll move to the machine learning thing. So the first story, which every talk of this sort has to tell, is really the question of, is the story of electronic commerce. So we all know that we can do online banking, electronic commerce, and so forth, and so on. And those of you who use Safari, this thing comes up. And encryption with the digital certificate keeps information private as it's sent, or from the website, and so forth. So there's this thing that comes up that says that digital certificates, or this is another synonyms for cryptography, is what enables you to use to do all these electronic commerce type things. But so the question is, how did this all start? So at this point, we're using it all the time. We don't even pay attention. Somehow we trust the fact that we're able to purchase and sell and transfer without thinking a second thought about it. How did it all start? So it all starts really from this very simple question, which is we have, and usually we call them Alice and Bob. They want to communicate in privacy. There are 2 parties, just 2 parties in the world, except there's someone who's listening on the line. And traditionally, the way this problem is solved is that these guys meet in advance and they agree on something called a secret key. I know there's some physicists here, and you probably know all this stuff also, but in any case, a secret key is just an algorithm. It's sort of a secret algorithm or a secret piece of information that enables you now, instead of just sending message M, you send what we call an encrypted M. And Alice knows how to send it, Bob knows how to receive it, all is good. Except in the modern world, really, Bob is Amazon or some other large company, and you can't have Alice go and meet Amazon and agree on a secret key, because there are too many Alices. That's just not going to scale. And in 1976, essentially, this idea by Diffie and Hellman, I think Diffie was a student at Berkeley at some point, and Hellman at Stanford, they invent the notion of this thing called public key cryptography. And this is the paper. And essentially what it is, without getting into details, is that they provide some sort of blueprint, okay, for a system where people can communicate secretly without having to meet and exchange a secret key. So you don't have to go to Amazon and agree on a key, but somehow automatically there is a way for you to send messages to Amazon secretly without exchanging a secret key. And here is a technical slide, and that is how? Well, essentially there's a lock and there's a key. There's a way to publish a public lock, okay, where people can lock their messages, send them over locked, so that on the other side, Amazon, who has the secret key, can open. So rather than having both of us having a key, there's a lock and there's a key, and the lock is public and everyone can use it. It's kind of a mesmerizing idea. How do you do it? That's a good question. How do you do it? And they got the Turing Award for the idea and for some implementations of it, but the real implementation came a year later by Reves, Shamir, and Adelman, who are these three guys, where they came up with a way to use number theory, that same paper that Manuel showed us in the class, a few years later. They came up with a way to use number theory in order to implement the lock and the key. So sort of to show how to lock messages, using some sort of number theoretic transformation, which was sort of one way, whereas there is some secret information that allows you to unlock it and make it reversible so that Amazon can read it. And what is it? So, which is a little bit relevant also for the later in the talk, so we'll go through it. So you all know about numbers, the factoring. I'm sure everybody here knows that factoring integers, composite integers, is a hard problem. In fact, when it's small, of course, everybody can do it, like 35 is 5 times 7. Some humans can do even this very quickly. And this is a long time for most humans, and 1,000-digit number seems to escape even the fastest algorithm out there. Okay, so this is a hard problem. It's a problem that if we go back to this idea of curiosity, it's a problem that, there are quotes by Gauss that says the dignity of science itself seems to require that every possible means be explored for the solution of a problem so elegant. So he wasn't thinking about public key cryptography, he wasn't thinking about computers, about telephones, but just this problem of taking a number and decomposing it into prime factors. It was just so elegant, so simple, so beautiful that he said we should really put a lot of effort into it. We still should, because we don't know how to do it. And it is the basis of this difficulty of this problem that enables this RSA, this public key cryptography, because what's going to happen is the lock is going to be the product of two numbers, the n, and based just on knowing this product, this n, you are able to send encrypted messages, but the key is going to be the factorization of this lock, those two primes that you multiply together to get the number, okay? And somehow we can take primes and multiplying them, because multiplying is an easy operation, so we can create a lock that we only know the key. Great. So this is the birth of public key cryptography. Also, these guys got the Turing Award for it, and because it really cemented the transition of the internet sort of from primarily military applications to commercial. Because now that you don't have to meet in advance, and everybody can send messages, let's say in privacy without meeting, we can talk about Amazon. We can talk about, Amazon wasn't there at that time, but we can talk about commercial applications. And in fact, I gave this part of this talk in front of Congress where we're trying to convince them to give money for basic research and saying, look, there's such a small investment, an NSF grant, less than $100,000 at the time, and it led to billion-dollar industry. From this nice, simple idea, it seems to have revolutionized how we do transactions over the internet. However, having said that, it takes a long time. So to go from basic idea to really like a standard, okay? Apparently, I asked Ron for the history of this, and it's like 25 years. From 1982 till when they started the standardization till 2009, there's effort after effort, trial after trial. It gets denied. Partially, they say things, but they don't name RSA because RSA has a patent. On and on and on. That's not really the topic of this class, of this talk. But the point is that there might be a long time. It might take 25 years from actual idea to acceptance. These days, it seems to be much shorter. But that certainly was the case then. Okay, what's another example? So meanwhile, in the physics world, okay, in around 1982, Feynman was busy building or thinking about envisioning powerful quantum computers. These were theoretical computers, where there was theoretical operations, which were consistent with quantum physics. And in 1994, about 12 years later, Peter Shor, who's now at MIT and then was in Bell Labs, invents a fast factoring algorithm, a way to take those composite numbers, the 35 into 5 times 7. That's not a joke, because that's about what these quantum computers can do. But right now. But in principle, it's what we call polynomial time efficient algorithm, even when the numbers get very large. But it's a theoretical algorithm. It's a theoretical algorithm on a hypothetical quantum computer, where there's some of these operations. But as I said, really the most recent number that I know that has been factored by such a realization of this kind of machine is 143, which is 11 times 13. Still, it is the case that things are progressing. So Google, Microsoft, IBM, lots of other companies and countries are racing towards this idea of building a quantum computer. There's a lot of invested in it, and so much the case that people paying attention to it. So the National Institute for Standards says, okay, maybe right now this is not a threat, but we have to prepare to a time where quantum computers, oh yeah, right, before that I just want to say this is a famous cartoon, right? How's your quantum computer prototype coming along? Umesh is not here. So, is he? Yes, okay. So it says the project exists in a simultaneous state of being both totally successful, not even started. Can I observe it? That's a tricky question. So it's, but all that, the truth is that I just say that, but both NSA and the National Institute of Standards have started planning for post-quantum cryptography. So they're saying, okay, and what if it is built? We have to make sure that our entire economy doesn't collapse if all of a sudden all these things that are in place are not secure anymore. And what do? It's all based on number theory, on factoring, as I described it so far. So it turns out that around 1906, Miklos Aitai, who's a theorist from IBM Research, completely divorced of anything to do with quantum computing, shows an entirely different form of cryptography. This time he doesn't use number theory, he uses geometry. He uses some problems which have to do with integer lattices or computing short vectors there. So the factoring problem here, the hard problem is computing a short vector in a lattice, giving the basis. And it's completely different, okay? It has nothing to do with factoring. And particularly, we don't know how to break this problem, the equivalent of factoring for this problem, how to factor with a quantum computer. And this gives us a current candidate for how to essentially do cryptography and not worry for now about quantum computers, okay? So in fact, it's not only there's new constructions which resist what we know right now to do on quantum computers, but they actually are a lot more capabilities than we could have done with the number theory. So it turns out to be an extremely interesting form of cryptography, this geometry-based cryptography. And just to give you, for those of you who are sort of a little more technically inclined here, is that there was a paper by Oded Regev in 2005 which showed a reduction from this geometry problem of Aitai to the following much simpler to state problem. And that is, let's say that there is some secret S, which is a vector in a finite field. And we can think of this vector as S1 through Sn or S1 through S4 in this case. And what you're given is you're not told what S1, S2, and S4 are. You're given some equations. You're given coefficients of equations, okay? And the solution to the equation, of course, if you were given exact solution to the equation, you could find these S's, just do Gaussian elimination, system of equations. But what you are given are noisy equations. So you're given essentially these equations with a little bit of Gaussian noise. And it turns out that this is a very hard problem, as hard as that geometry problem that Aitai introduced. And it is an incredibly easy to work with problem. We can, based on the difficulty of finding these S's, okay, it's a hard problem, we can come up with crypto systems. So the difficulty of finding this S's is like factoring the number in the previous example. That's the difficult problem. And this is a kind of fantastic because it seems to resist quantum algorithms. It leads to a lot more interesting cryptography that we could have done with number theory, something called homomorphic encryption, which is sort of computing in the dark, and other things. And in fact, these days there are these standardization efforts, and there's lots and lots of proposals of how to do cryptography, digital signatures, encryption, many other things based on these new problems. This, what we call learning with error problem, which relates back to Aitai. So we did two examples. One was public key cryptography, number theory. Two was this quantum resilient cryptography, Aitai. And now I want to get to zero knowledge. So let's say that Alice and Bob don't want to just communicate secretly, but let's think now that Alice wants to log into Bob's website. Let's say he's Amazon again. And she says, I'm Alice, let me buy whatever I like. And he says, okay, prove it. And the way you usually think about it is you send a secret password to Amazon, right? Now the thing is that Amazon has a lot of passwords, and we worry that maybe someone can break into that website. Maybe they can be broken, leaked from, maybe there are malicious insiders. And this is not a fake kind of worry, because we keep on hearing about these compromises of passwords. And I don't know about you, do you check anymore whether your password is one of that list? Some of you do, maybe. How many of you check? Nobody. I see we really care about our confidentiality. Okay, in any case, neither do I though. But all right, so the question is the following. Okay, so that's the situation. Is there any chance that Alice can prove to Bob that she knows the password without actually giving it? So is there a way that I could prove to you that I know the password and you don't even have to store it? Okay, so you don't have to, I'm not going to give it to you because you have nothing to compare it against. And yet you'll know that it is Shafi and that I do know the password. So to be a little bit more concrete, the way we'll think about passwords now is the ability to solve very hard mathematical problems. Okay, so I know the password that enables me to solve certain mathematical problems. You have a different password that enables you to solve certain mathematical problem, and so forth. And what mathematical problem? The one we've talked about before. So me or Alice, let's say that we have a number associated with me, a very large number that I know how to factor because maybe I created that number by taking 2 and multiplying it. I could just send it over. Not good, right? Because that means that everybody can see my password, and in particular, that would be insecure. So that brings me to the next question, and that is, can I prove to Bob that I know the 2 primes P and Q such that n equal to PQ without giving them? How do I do that? How do I prove to you that I know how to factor a number without actually giving you the factorization? So the answer to that is really this first paper with, Silvio, and who's going to speak here next week, and is going to be at that lunch that you alluded to for an interview with the 2 of us, and Charlie Rakoff. And it's another one of the papers mentioned in our Turing Award, which is zero knowledge proofs. So these are proofs that yield nothing but the validity. So what is the validity of n equal to PQ? The validity that there are 2 primes, P and Q, that when you multiply them together, you get n, okay? And I want to prove to you that's the case without actually giving you those primes. And what this work does is it shows you how to do it. So what is the main idea there? So one way to say the idea is that essentially I prove that I could provide the password if I felt like it. I could if I felt like it, and I don't feel like it though. And you can verify that. And to be a little bit more technical, the idea is that we show a way to derive from the proof, from the classical proof, a sequence of mathematical challenges or computational challenges, hard computational challenges, which the verify generates. So remember, there's a verify. Once the verify know the password, that's Amazon. There is a way that they can generate some challenges for me to solve. If I know the proof, if I know the password, if I know the factorization, I can solve these mathematical challenges. So every time they come up with a challenge, I can solve it. Another challenge, I can solve it. However, if I don't know it, I really can do no better than guess at random. That is the idea. It's kind of, again, a method to transform these classical proofs into these new kind of proofs, which are essentially a sequence of challenges, each time generated at random, that can be solved if I knew the classical proof, and otherwise I do no better than 50-50. Okay? That is the idea. And now I'm going to get to the most technical part of my talk. And this is, so obviously that will solve the identity theft problem. Here's the most technical part of my talk. Okay, so here's an idea of how this thing works. How many of you have seen it? Some of you have seen it. All right, so there is the prover, okay? And what she wants to prove to Bob or Amazon, who happens to be colorblind, is that on this piece of paper there are 2 colors, red on the top and green on the bottom. Bob, he's colorblind. He has absolutely no idea whether 2 colors there or 1 color. As far as he can tell, it's 1 color. Okay? How can Alice prove this to Bob? She cannot give him the power to see colors. This is like the classical proof. But she can still, here I'll show you a way that you can convince him there are 2 colors. And the truth is, as simple as it sounds, it's kind of the crux of the idea for all the mathematical proofs as well. Except you have to translate colors to math and so forth. So the idea is the following. She says to him, listen, the top is 1 color, the bottom is the other, let's say red and green. And what Bob is going to do is that, first of all, it's going to be very important that he has the ability of tossing a coin. Okay, it's very important to be able to toss a coin. And what he's going to do is he's going to toss the coin, okay? And if it falls on heads, what he's going to do is nothing. He takes this page, does nothing. But if it falls on tails, then he decides to flip and put the green on top. So let's say that he flipped the coin like I showed you, and he came up tails, and now green is on top. Okay? Now what he does this in the privacy of his own computer or in his own office, and then he ships back that page, which either has still red on top or he flipped it to green. He sends it over back to Alice. And he challenges her to guess the outcome of his coin toss. Now it's a coin toss. I mean, how is she going to know what coins he's tossing at home? However, if there were 2 colors here, and she tossed the coin, if she didn't change the order, it must have fallen on heads. If she did change the order, it must have fallen on tails. She knows color. There are 2 colors here if it's in fact a true claim. And she just tells him what she thinks the outcome of the coin is, which she can 100% do if there were 2 colors on this page. And he followed the protocol. So she names the color on the top. And Bob says, if she's wrong about this, she can't guess my coin. There must have not been 2 colors. I reject the claim out of hand. But if she's right, he says, maybe she guessed my coin. Maybe there are 2 colors. 50-50 chance that in fact there are 2 colors, and that's what enabled her to guess my coin. Are we okay? We're okay. All right. half is not such a great probability. We do this again. You know, he tosses another coin. He again flips the page. He asks her to name the color. She names the color. What's the chance that she's correct twice in a row? Even though there's only one color. Well, she could be lucky once. She could be lucky twice. A quarter probability that she's lucky twice, but there's really only one color there. They keep going like this 100 times. And what can we claim? We claim that essentially there's what we call completeness and soundness. If there are two colors on this page, Bob will always accept the claim is true because Alice can always guess his coin tosses. What are the chances she guesses 100 coins in a row? 1 in 2 to 100. That's very small. I accept that as an error in the proof. And there is a soundness, and that is that if there's only one color, the chance that the probability that after 100 iteration he will reject her in a lie is very close to 1. 1 minus 1 in 2 to 100. Okay, so what has happened here? What happened here is that he was giving her these challenges, you know, and testing to see whether she can tell whether he flipped the page or didn't flip the page. Because she can tell color, she can answer those challenges. If she couldn't tell color, she couldn't do better than 50-50, and after a while he would have caught her. So this is why, we call this a zero knowledge proof. Because at the end, Bob doesn't know how to tell color. In fact, what did he receive from this whole thing? Essentially, he flipped some page, okay, which he couldn't, you know, I mean, you could flip it all day long. And then he got back the result of the coin that he himself tossed. So he had nothing new. If, in fact, she's not lying. If she was lying, then sometimes she would be right, sometimes she would be wrong. But if it's true, basically, he has received absolutely zero knowledge except believing that she can tell green from red, and therefore there are two colors, and two colors exist in this world. Wonderful. This is an example of something more general, which we call interactive and probabilistically verifiable proofs, where the claims are not about colors. It's really any mathematical theorem that you can think of. We can convert it into a sequence of questions and answers between a prover and a verifier who can toss coins and runs efficiently, and at the end of which we're able to show that if the claim was true, there is a way to convince the verifier to accept, and if the claim was false, then the verifier will reject with 1 minus negligible probability. Something happened here. I keep using this word proof very kind of loosely. Interactive and probabilistic proofs, people usually think about proofs as something that's 100% correct. Well, we allow a probability of error. We're saying you can prove correct theorems, you may not be able to prove, you may be able to prove incorrect theorems, but very, very small probability. And ultimately, I guess that is what a proof is. There's been wide applicability of zero knowledge proofs. So we're done sort of with the concept. What has it been used for? It's been used for identity theft prevention. In 1986, there was a paper by Goldrach, Mikhail, and Vigderson where they show that, in fact, it's not just certain theorems, but you can do this for every theorem, which means that you can really take protocols that are designed to be secure against innocent people who don't try to deviate and convert them into protocols that can be secure against parties who are deviating. Because what they're going to do is every time they do a step and they send a message, they have to attach a proof, a zero knowledge proof that the message they're sending is the correct message. And then very recently, there are these very strange, in some sense, applications, zero knowledge and nuclear disarmament. These are projects at Princeton and MIT, so they're respectable university, maybe not as much as Berkeley, but still, you know, it's these projects where they took this concept of of zero knowledge and applied it to this question of whether you trust, let's say, the Russians and the Americans trust each other to disarm a nuclear warhead, and they don't want to show them their technology. So they don't want to expose them to their nuclear warheads. And somehow there's a way to replace digital steps by steps that have to do with measuring radiation and throwing beams at nuclear warheads and so forth. Another very interesting paper is on zero knowledge and forensics. So here the idea, suppose there's a crime scene and someone claims that they were not the criminal. The police says, okay, prove it. I would like you to give me a DNA sample. But they don't want to do it because now the police has their DNA sample. So is there a way to prove that my DNA doesn't match the one on the crime scene without actually giving my DNA? Again, in zero knowledge. And there is actually a paper that shows how to do that. Of course, assuming there are some operations in a biological lab where you do sequencing, which are sort of tamper-proof. And then there is the work by Alexandru Chiesa from here and other people on zero cash, which is a cryptocurrency which protects the anonymity and privacy of transactions. So this is really using zero knowledge proofs in the digital sense to show that the transactions you're doing, let's say on a blockchain, actually are correct, or there is balance in your account without telling exactly what the balance is necessarily, and who you are. And this is again one of those examples where there is this zero knowledge idea, and over many years later, it becomes something that enables a currency that has extra properties beyond something like Bitcoin. And I guess also here there's standardization that has been put in place. It started about in May. I hope it doesn't take 25 years to get standardized, but you never know. Another example, before I move on to the machine learning, is the following. And this is a new work with Danny Weitzner and some students at MIT. And the idea here was the following. Turns out that there's this thing called electronic surveillance. I'm sure you've heard about it. There's been a lot of press about this. And there are tens of thousands of requests that are being made by the FBI and policing agencies to federal judges to get a warrant for surveillance. Okay, and what does that mean to places like Google or Facebook or Microsoft to be able to see digital content? And of course, you have to show a case, and the federal judge has to approve it. And obviously, because you don't want to jeopardize the investigation, it's all subject to sealing orders and gag orders. So nobody knows that there is a surveillance going on, right? There's no permission to talk about it or obviously to show the content of it. But what turns out is that, and this is Judge Smith, is a judge from Houston who wrote a whole bunch of papers about it, is it turns out that essentially most of these wiretaps, after a while, they're supposed to be unsealed. Why should you unseal it? Because the judicial system otherwise doesn't work very well. There's no way to scrutinize, there's no way to appeal, there's no way to test this in court. Still, it never gets unsealed. They're effectively sealed in perpetuity. So there's no opportunity for Congress or the public to even assess what the breadth and depth of this phenomena is. And what he proposed is there will be a cover sheet that gives very little information that will be filed somewhere that everybody can look at it. But the point is that using cryptography, and we built a system actually to do that, using zero knowledge, you could actually do much better than a cover sheet. You could prove properties about what's being sealed. You could prove, you could sort of timestamp it so that it gets unsealed in due time. And you would provide a mechanism essentially for the public to check how many of these wiretaps are done, are they getting unsealed on time, and so forth. So it kind of brings to mind this quote by Kafka: "Our laws are not generally known, they're kept secret by a small group of nobles who rule us. We're convinced that these ancient laws are scrupulously administered. Nevertheless, it's an extremely painful thing to be ruled by laws that one does not know." Okay. Anyway, so there is this system, and it was a paper, at least it's a kind of a prototype, where you can sort of see a protocol between the federal judge and the FBI, and then federal judge and the public that can sort of be informed, okay, and test that things are done properly. Okay, just one last word about proofs, and I'll go to machine learning. So one of the things, even zero knowledge aside, is that this idea of a proof, where you go back and forth, okay, and there's a probability of error, and then you don't just send the classical proof over, it essentially allows you to decouple this idea of checking correctness from knowing the proof. Somehow you can verify correctness without necessarily being able to prove to someone else, because you don't get to prove yourself. And this means you can ask a whole bunch of new questions about proofs, like can they be more efficient to verify? And the answer is yes. So not the ones that I showed you with the colors, but they can be in principle more efficient to verify. Can you prove more? Are there other ways to define probabilistic proof systems? So proof systems that have a probability of error, okay, that there's some chance that you are incorrect. And in fact, there's a very famous PCP theorem by another graduate here, Mandu. This is at Berkeley in '92. So Aurora was a student here, Lun, Matwani, and Sudan, and Safra. And Zegedi. In any case, they show this amazing theorem as graduate students, again, showing that if you allow this new proof mechanism where there's a probability of error, and it's a little bit more sophisticated than just a single prover going back and forth, then you can actually verify NP statements with high probability by only reading a constant number of bits of the proof. And that has led to a whole new theory of hardness of approximation problems. So really, Berkeley is a good place to be a graduate student, and hopefully also a professor. Okay, so I've gone through just a few of these examples. Talked about electronic commerce. We talked about NP getting a new definition, this interactive proofs. We talked a little bit about quantum computing, and we talked about zero knowledge. But next, I want to talk about what I see are some opportunities and challenges for using cryptography for machine learning. And I see Berkeley sort of a mecca for machine learning, so I think it's an interesting place to actually put down these challenges. So we all know, moving on to the 21st century, is that big data is not only talked about, but it really can change many things. So it's been applied to health, for disease control, by trend prediction, to finance, predictions for financial markets, consumer targeting with the ads, infrastructure, traffic patterns, energy usage, vision, which apparently now has completely changed from where it was to use, neural nets in terms of success, natural language understanding, threat prediction for viruses, and even things like policing, bail, credit rating. So this is so much in the news that it's not for me to repeat, but I just want to say that there are places, like apparently in New Jersey, they are looking at the court system, they are using an algorithm to set bail. So the courts have accepted that as a way to decide whether to let people out on bail or not. In New Orleans, there's an algorithm that is being used by the police in order to decide where to send the police cars, sort of analyzing data from the past and to decide where it's going to be most effective to send the police. So what does that mean? What is this sudden shift of power? So decisions that were made previously by people, maybe fallible people, okay, maybe meek and uninformed people, are now being made by those who have the data and have the algorithmic capability. Regardless how you see it, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, there's a sudden shift of power. And in fact, if you think, this is apparently some data that has been released, that the largest companies by market cap, in 2001 it was GE, it was energy companies, Exxon, and now they are all essentially data companies. So Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, those who hold the data, okay, seem to be holding the power. So it's sort of like the new currency. And this sudden shift of power, it can leave us unprotected and unregulated. I think we all agree with that. And the question is, what can cryptography do about that? So I think that my thesis for the rest of the talk, which is about 10 minutes, is that essentially after 30 plus years of working on methods that ensure privacy and correctness of computation, okay, which I showed you a little sample more about communication rather than computation, cryptography has tools and models that should enable to play a role in ensuring that the power is not abused. So let me give you an idea. This is not just wishful thinking. I think that there is something behind it. And let me enumerate some of the challenges that I think cryptography can help. Any questions? I've never given a talk with no questions. No questions? Okay. All right. So challenge one. So since, as I said, it seems like the power of ML comes from data. So having without the data, we weren't probably going to be here today. Today meaning in the state of affairs of machine learning, 2018. So it comes from data, and these data is from where? It's data of individuals. So one of the ways to ensure that this power shift is done properly is to ensure the privacy of both the data and the model. Okay, the machine learning model that's being developed during training and classifying. So training meaning, so you've got a lot of data that the model trains on, and then you come up with a good model, say this is a great predictor. And classifying, now the model has been decided on, now here's my data, tell me whether I should go on bail, where the police car should be set, should I get a loan or not get a loan. So in some sense, sort of power to the people. And the second thing is, models really are extremely important, right? And you want to make sure that they're not tampered with, nor any bias is introduced for profit or in control. So essentially, we want to develop methods to minimize the influence of maliciously chosen training data and to prove that the models were actually derived from the data. So we're sort of believing that these companies that have the data, they're using the data correctly to derive a model. But I don't know, we hope so. I'm not sure how many of you know whether there are sort of ways to double check that. And most of the work in cryptography today that has to do with machine learning works on these two problems. How to maintain the privacy of the data, how to, during training, during classifying, not so much about how to prove that the models were derived from the data, but it's also an opportunity for crypto. In some sense, I think that's why it's being done, is to use all these techniques we developed for the last 30 plus years for the purpose of machine learning. Say finally, somebody wants us, beyond electronic commerce. But there are other challenges. So another challenge is something that, again, people in machine learning are talking about a lot, and that is that there are some, not in the training, but even in classifying, that there are some clever manipulations that one could do of the input by an adversary that can cause misclassifications. And the famous examples are for the self-driving cars, right? The example where you can misclassify a stop sign to be an yield sign, and that is, or maybe you could misclassify, instead of detecting a virus, something can get be classified as a good program rather than a bad program. So these are well-known problems, and what does cryptography have to do with it? So this is the adversary with the black box access to the machine learning algorithm, and after a while he can actually come up with an example that will misclassify. So we do have, as cryptographers, we as the royal we, a vast experience in sort of mathematical modeling of adversarial behavior. Because this is essentially what cryptography was always about. There is an adversary, and there are many things that the adversary can do, either by breaking from inside or by deriving some partial information. And this task of trying to generalize a class of attacks and model it as a mathematical general behavior is something that cryptographers do very well. So I know that there's some, I'm sure there's work elsewhere, but I'm familiar with this work by Alexander Madry, where he says, let's look at domain-specific attacks. So he looks at images and say, what are some kind of attacks you could do on an image? Maybe you perturb it, maybe you transform it, maybe you rotate it. And for those attacks, for those domain-specific attacks, he's able to show how to train neural nets in such a way that they will be robust against the same type of attacks. But the question is, how do you go beyond the domain-specific attacks? How do you come up with a class of attacks? Maybe low-complexity attacks, maybe things that can run in parallel. I have no idea. But what I do know is that we have witnessed a very, very similar situation where in cryptography, when we talked about something called side-channel attacks, where people came paper after paper saying, you know, if you could measure the time that it takes to perform a cryptographic operation, or the power that radiates, you know, this is a power attack, or cache attack, then you can translate this in a way to recover a secret key. So then people came along and they said, let's capture these type of attacks, timing, cache, power, as some sort of mathematical transformation, and come up with schemes that are provably secure against anything captured by that mathematical set of transformations. And it would be an interesting thing to do that also for attacks that lead to adversarial examples. What's another, the holy grail here, of course, is to build some model where misclassification requires learning some cryptographic hard task. So if you misclassify, it means you could solve something you shouldn't be able to solve. And that would be a proof that you cannot misclassify. Of course, the question is, what is that task? It won't be factoring. You need something which is much more fine-grained, something that's hard to do for exactly the same type of network that you're used for classification. Another entirely different challenge is the following. So, you know, there's something called GDPR, or even in California, they've passed these rules now, or laws, a digital privacy law, which grants consumers more control over and insight into the spread of their personal information. So I may give one company my data, but they're not supposed to give it to someone else. I might have authorized them to use it, but it doesn't mean that I authorize them to give it to someone else. So can you come up with methods to trace the fact that your data was used to train a certain model? Of course, not every single user, but maybe probabilistically, every once in a while that would happen. You could be able to trace it. Of course, the problem is this. Wait a second. You might be introducing vulnerability this way. So you want to make sure that you can trace the data that was used for learning the model without introducing new vulnerabilities. Another way to say that, and this is sort of work in progress, is that wouldn't it be nice to be able to data trace unless privacy-preserving learning algorithm was used? So have a double-edged sword. So to show that either you actually used a way to preserve the privacy of the training data, maybe with differential privacy for those who know what it is, or if you didn't, then there will be a way to trace somebody's data will come out. So it will be sort of an if and only if type of theorem. That's a very interesting direction, in my opinion. Another example is that not only that you want people not to use your data, but you don't want them to use your model. Maybe somebody stole my model, and now they're trying to sell it. So can you watermark these type of models? So there's some works on this, some sort of cute work, which probably will be broken, but in any case, which shows how to watermark deep neural nets by essentially training the network to accept watermarks which cannot be distinguished from sort of naive-looking classification data. So in some sense, the reason why they call it turning weakness into strength is because they take these planted adversarial examples which are the watermarks. So those things which should not be which are getting misclassified, it's actually on purpose because that's the way you've watermarked your model. What else? What is another challenge? Another challenge is, what about randomness? You know, again, I'm not an expert in this field. I mean, far from it. But as far as I understand, randomness is important for training in the sense of how you look at the data, how do you maybe setting of the weights, the initial values of weights on let's say on neural nets. So there are a lot of machine learning phases where randomness is important. What type of randomness is used? I've asked my colleagues, they say there's this rand operation that you call on the computer. So as a cryptographer, one is horrified by this answer. I don't know. I mean, does it affect stability if you use really good, unpredictable randomness? Maybe it does. Is secrecy of the randomness important? There's a whole set of questions you could ask there. What type of randomness should be used to be able to claim things as if this was totally, like a little man tossing a coin, or a woman? Another thing that would be interesting is to define sort of specialized cryptographic functionalities which are ML complete. So some functionality which would be good enough and strong enough to do any kind of machine learning algorithm. And the reason why that's interesting is because efficiency is performance is everything here. You can use heavy hammer cryptographic methods to solve a lot of these challenges, but they're too expensive. So the question is, can you define something that's small enough and efficient enough to implement that would be sort of complete in order to solve all these challenges? And then you talk about reductions. How do you reduce one such reductions between such a functionality to a general purpose machine learning algorithm? So these are really the challenges that I wanted to mention. I think it's a real opportunity for developing new theory also for cryptography. So it's not necessarily only that it will solve maybe problems that are out there by machine learning, but I think it begs sort of, there'll be some interesting cryptography that will come out of it at the end. Now, having said all these challenges, it's not that things aren't done. In fact, there is a lot that's done. I won't be able to have time to talk about it, but essentially the big kind of idea here is that you either look at the training phase and you want to retain the privacy of the data set that you're training on, and essentially this is done often by choosing existing cryptographic building blocks and putting them into play. So we have like a, it's like a Chinese restaurant. We take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, we put it together, and we prove that it works. The question whether it scales and whether this can really handle large data sets. And the other thing is when we talk about classification, and that is where someone has already a model and somebody user gives in data and you want to preserve, he wants to make sure his data is private and the model owner might want to preserve the secrecy of the model. How do you do that? So again, we can use things that are known. I think the big idea in this field and some interesting work is what I call approximate functionality. And that is to say, all right, you know what? We are going to use the kind of encryption or the kind of crypto capability which is only approximately correct, but since the neural net anyway only approximately has to classify, it will be good enough. So if I had time, I would explain exactly what it means. But there's an idea here of how to relax the requirements on the crypto and maybe relax the requirement on the machine learning so that they could mesh together and the performance would be good enough. So I was going to say many more things. I will not say them except for the fact that there's many works. In principle, everything can be solved. Even in polynomial time, everything can be solved. However, people these days are working on concrete efficiency, sort of not just polynomial time, but the concrete running times. And still, with all that, it's all proofs of concept. So it's done in universities, it's done here by Raluca's group and others. And it's a proof of concept. But I think it's very interesting where this is going to go to. And I am going to go ahead and get to my last slide. You see the dog? That's not my last slide. He's being classified as an angry dog. I want to just say that essentially, this is my last slide, and that is that cryptography proves that investing in basic research in 1976 brings us to a lot of yield today. And in 2050, I don't know where we're going to be, but certainly if we don't invest in basic research today, we won't get there. And it's preaching to the choir. Obviously, you agree with me because you are in university here. And the second thing is that there's all these new machine learning challenges, and I think that's an opportunity to develop new crypto theory. So thank you.
I believe we have time for questions.
Oh, we do?
And
okay,
there's a few microphones. There's Sheila.
Can I just make a quick announcement? So the Eve's Colloquium will begin right after this question period ends. and it's going to be across the street in the auditorium in Silver Hall.
It's on hold. Yes. So for our folks that are not here, Sheila, we have one in front, right? So we can get the questions on there as well as the answers.
Shafi, for the people, can you describe a little bit what it will be that is different in the future when we have safe ML versus the unsafe ML that we have today?
Okay, so safe is a word that one invented, right? When I say safe, I guess I mean several things. One is the privacy of my data during training. If I contribute data, I don't want you necessarily, you as someone who's building a model, to know what my data is. And often there's many, so there's a thing called federated ML, so there's data coming from many users, and the question is how they can go through a protocol at the end of which the model will emerge, but the data of individuals won't be transparent. That's one. So privacy is important, in my opinion. Second of all, there is reliability, that these models aren't just going to reflect, the interests of some company that is taking the data and could convert it into a model. So you want these models to be reliable. You want to be able to receive verification, proof, certificates that the models are reliable. This means that when these decisions are made, like policing or particular neighborhoods or refusing somebody to give a loan and so forth, you would be able, no, actually that's a different, so privacy is one thing, then policing and fairness and all that is a whole field which I didn't talk about, which I don't see where cryptography really comes in, but that would be under safe ML. And maybe another possibility is a question of whether you can tweak these models, okay, in an unrecognized way. So somebody can modify them or mold them, and you won't be able to recognize that. You certainly don't want to do that. I know that when we sell, I don't know anything about self-driving cars except I would love to use one. But I assume, okay, that misclassification is not the only problem. Another problem might be things like side channel attacks. Perhaps these systems, when you measure some usage, you can actually learn much more about the parameters of it and can mislead it. That's a handful of. Okay, which side? You can raise your hand, you don't need a microphone.
I'll slip in a question while we're waiting for it to get up front. You spoke a lot about privacy.
Yeah.
And you touched on, in the case of judicial reform, transparency.
Mm-hmm.
As we move forward, does transparency become as important a cryptographic goal as privacy is?
So the reason I mentioned judicial, even though it didn't seem like it has to do with privacy, is because of this whole question of who holds the power. And where is the power coming from? If the power is coming from data, you want to make sure that your data is either kept private or it's yours to control, whether you want to give it or not give it, and to make sure that it's used properly. And your question is what?
Transparency to so many places. Why do we believe that all of those votes were counted correctly in that outcome, for example?
Right.
That's a
so voting,
question of you could imagine a similar interactive process to prove that.
Yes. So voting is a kind of an ancient problem that people have looked at. It's how do you make sure that you can prove that votes were tallied up correctly? So I didn't talk at all about computation in the dark. It's a whole field where we know how to do that. We can sort of encrypted votes and let's say the government can prove that they tallied up those votes correctly. And that's done in zero knowledge. Actually, that's a zero knowledge type question. And a computation. So you're able to add encrypted votes without actually decrypting them.
Sounds like a good idea. We have a question.
Hi, Shafi. So crypto has a long tradition. You even mentioned a couple of examples of schemes that were proposed that were later broken. So I wonder what's your feeling about these kinds of schemes? Are we doing things at the right pace? Does there need to be more care, more adventure?
Right. So crypto, I think it's very important that when you propose a cryptographic scheme, you provide a proof. So what does it mean to prove? I'm assuming here, let's say that factoring is a hard problem. By proof here, I mean that there's a reduction between breaking the cryptographic scheme to, let's say, a factoring algorithm. In which case, it's what we call a win-win situation, where either you can have a foolproof system, or you factored integers, which in our book is maybe as more important. I don't know. It's hard to imagine that somebody would come up with a factoring algorithm by attacking a cryptographic scheme that's based on the hardness of factoring, but possibly that's when you put the effort in. So when I say that, so a scheme that has been developed for cryptography has to have with it some sort of a rigor, a proof that it's reducible to a problem, which we believe is a hard problem. These are the kind of crypto that I have described. Some of the cryptography could be reduced to the fact that you believe that a certain piece of hardware obeys properties that are being claimed, and then maybe someone is attacking the hardware. The cryptographic proof still stands, and you could replace the hardware with something else, but you want to have a proof to go along. So those schemes that you are saying, that you are alluding to, that were broken, I'm willing to bet did not come with a proof, certainly not by a proof that's been verified. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. So you mentioned federated ML, and stuff like differentially private gradient sharing and secure hardware are far from the only advances in sort of intersecting crypto theory and ML. But it seems from this timeline, we have quite a ways to go. So where do you feel like we are in this journey of getting to safe machine learning?
I really think that it's amazing to me for preparing a much larger version of this talk that only focused on machine learning. I think I've read most of the, at least I've been pointed to most of the papers on using crypto for machine learning or the safe machine learning, and it's amazing in the last 2 years how many works have been written, and a lot of good ideas. So if there's such a large community of people working on it, I think that progress will be made. Maybe some of these problems are not solvable, and then someone could show in principle that you cannot solve them. But we've shown throughout this year, if anything of this work is that you come up with another model, you come up with another definition, and you are able to achieve it. So I'm actually optimistic. I think the problem really is more the definitions here. What does it mean, safe machine learning? I mean, I put things very informally, and I think the definitions that are out there, in fact, even this fairness question, there's so many definitions. And I'm not sure even how they compare to each other. So coming up with the right set of definitions is probably key. Once it's done, I'm optimistic from what I've seen in the past that these things can be solved. Okay, thank you.